After the accident, his entire world flipped upside down. Once the kind of man who made headlines for his success, Ethan Montgomery now found himself trapped in silence, surrounded by the cold walls of a mansion that used to echo with laughter. To prove that he was still worthy of trust, he planned something bold, a grand party to celebrate his recovery, his comeback. The lights were on, the table was set, music played softly in the background. But no one came. Not a single car pulled into the driveway. No friends, no business partners, not even the relatives who once fought to sit beside him at his glamorous dinners. The house, bright as a diamond, stood empty, a symbol of everything he had lost. But among all the people who had turned their backs on him, one remained. Clara, the housemaid who had been there through every sleepless night, every broken promise, every tear that fell when no one was watching. She didn't have fame or fortune, but what she did have was heart, and she was about to offer something Ethan never expected. She walked into the silent ballroom, where he sat in his wheelchair, staring at the untouched wine glasses. The pain in his eyes said everything: betrayal, loneliness, shame. Without hesitation, Clara approached, knelt beside him, and took his hand. "If the world gave up on you," she whispered softly, "I won't." He looked at her, lost for words. That simple moment, her hand holding his, was the first warmth he had felt in months. And what she did next changed everything. To the world, Ethan and his wife Vanessa looked perfect. A power couple, living in a beautiful mansion in Charleston, South Carolina, admired by everyone for their elegance and success. But behind those expensive walls, the truth was bitter. Their love had turned into routine, their smiles into rehearsed performances. Arguments had become part of the daily soundtrack of that house. At night, behind closed doors, their voices echoed through the marble hallways. Anger, resentment, disappointment. Vanessa accused Ethan of controlling everything, the business, her choices, even her dreams. He, on the other hand, felt the distance growing between them like a cliff no one could cross anymore. One cold winter evening, the tension exploded. They were in the library, the oldest room in the house, once Ethan's sanctuary. Surrounded by old books and the smell of whiskey, Vanessa's voice trembled with fury. "You think you can keep manipulating my life forever?" she shouted. Ethan tried to stay calm, his voice breaking with exhaustion. "I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to save what's left of us." But words turned into something darker. In a moment of rage, Vanessa opened the drawer of an antique desk and pulled out a gun, a family relic that had belonged to Ethan's late father. His heart froze at the sight. "Vanessa, please, don't do this," he begged, lifting his trembling hand toward her. The sound that followed shattered the night, a single gunshot that echoed through the mansion like thunder. Ethan fell backward, pain burning through his spine. He tasted iron in his mouth, the scent of gunpowder mixing with his blood. His vision blurred, the world dimmed, and as darkness closed in, the last thing he heard was the metallic clink of the gun hitting the floor. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The gunshot echoed through the mansion, bouncing off the walls like a haunting memory. Then came the silence, heavy, absolute, terrifying. For a few endless seconds, there was only the faint crackling of the fireplace and the sound of Ethan's shallow breath. His body lay motionless on the carpet, blood slowly staining the pattern beneath him. Footsteps rushed down the hallway. It was Clara, the maid who had served the family for over 10 years. When she entered the room and saw Ethan on the floor, her scream sliced through the silence. "Oh my God, Ethan!" she cried, dropping beside him, pressing her hands over the wound to stop the bleeding. Her fingers trembled, but her voice was firm. "Hold on, sir. Please hold on. I'm here. You're not alone." Vanessa stood frozen across the room, the gun lying near her feet, her face pale with shock. She didn't say a word. It was as if she couldn't comprehend what she had just done. Clara, shaking, grabbed the phone and called for an ambulance, shouting directions while begging Ethan not to close his eyes. Every second felt like an hour. When the distant sound of sirens finally reached the gates, hope flickered again. Paramedics stormed in, lifting Ethan's body onto a stretcher. Clara followed them outside, tears running down her face as the red lights reflected off the mansion's glass windows. That night, the house that had once been full of life turned into a grave of silence and guilt. The doctors worked for hours. Surgery after surgery, machine after machine, they fought to keep Ethan alive. And when the sun finally rose, he had survived. But the bullet had done its damage. The diagnosis came like a verdict: permanent paralysis. The man who once stood tall in every boardroom, who danced through his own galas, now faced a future confined to a wheelchair, and that realization broke something deep inside him. The first few days at the hospital felt like a parade. Ethan's room was never empty. Flowers, cameras, people pretending to care. Colleagues from the company came with shiny smiles and hollow promises. "You're strong, Ethan. You'll walk again," they said, posing for photos like his pain was a publicity event. The room smelled of expensive perfume and insincerity. But as the weeks passed, the crowd began to fade. The flowers wilted, the visits slowed. The business partners were the first to disappear. "Take care of yourself," they had said. "We'll handle things for now." But for now turned into forever. Soon the relatives stopped showing up too. The same people who once bragged about being close to him suddenly found excuses not to visit. Even his so-called friends, the ones who used to toast champagne by his side, began avoiding him. One day a former friend dropped by, his visit quick and awkward. "Must be hard living like this, huh?" he muttered. That sentence cut deeper than the bullet ever had. The look in his eyes wasn't pity. It was discomfort, the kind people feel when they're forced to face someone else's tragedy. And then came the media. The story spread like wildfire. Millionaire shot by his wife after heated argument. Headlines twisted every detail, turning Ethan into a spectacle, a scandal. Some said he deserved it. Others suggested he had orchestrated it himself for attention or power. It didn't matter what the truth was. People only believed the version that entertained them most. In a matter of weeks, Ethan Montgomery went from being a respected businessman to a public mystery. A man people whispered about, but no one truly knew. And when he finally returned home, the weight of those stares, those silent judgments, felt heavier than the wheelchair he now lived in. And what came next would test the last bit of hope he had left. The mansion felt colder than ever. Every sound echoed: the creak of the floor, the ticking of the old clock, even the soft hum of the wind outside. The staff had quit one by one, too uncomfortable to stay after what had happened. Rumors about Ethan spread like wildfire through the city. Some said he had manipulated his wife. Others called him a monster behind a charming smile. He stopped answering calls. He stopped opening the curtains. The man who once ruled meetings and parties now spent hours staring at the same wall, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. And yet in the middle of that silence, one person's footsteps still echoed down the halls. Clara, she never left. Every morning, she brewed his coffee, even when she knew he wouldn't drink it. She pushed his wheelchair to the terrace so he could feel the sun again, even when he didn't ask. She dusted the piano that hadn't been played in months, hoping he'd one day want to hear music again. Ethan couldn't understand why she stayed. Everyone else had a reason to leave. One night, as she adjusted the pillows behind his back, he finally asked the question that haunted him. "Why are you still here, Clara?" "Everyone else gave up on me." She stopped for a moment, her eyes fixed on the blanket she was straightening. Then softly she said, "Because I know the truth. I was there that night. You didn't deserve what happened, And no one deserves to face this alone. Her words hit him harder than any headline, any lie, any betrayal. For the first time in months, Ethan felt seen, not as a victim, not as a millionaire, but as a man. And though he didn't know it yet, that single night marked the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. Months had passed since the tragedy, and Ethan was learning to live with his new reality. The pain was still there, physical, emotional, invisible, but deep down, a small spark refused to die. He needed to prove to himself and to the world that he was still the same man, that he hadn't been defeated. So one afternoon, while staring out at the garden through the window, he made a decision. He would host a party, not just any party, a celebration of his recovery, a declaration that he was alive, strong, and ready to reclaim his place in the world. Clara tried to hide her concern, but she could see the fear behind his excitement. For days, the mansion buzzed with preparation. Lights were strung along the garden path. Tables were draped in white linen. Imported wines lined the bar. Even the grand piano in the main hall was polished and tuned for the first time in months. Ethan had new suits brought in, determined to look like the man he once was. On the night of the party, he wore a dark tailored jacket and asked Clara to fix his tie. His hands trembled slightly, his eyes shining with hope. "Tonight will be different," he whispered, as if convincing himself. "They'll come, Clara, you'll see." She just nodded, forcing a smile. The clock struck 8. The gates opened. Music began to play softly in the background, but the minutes passed. And no one arrived. 8:15, 8:30, 9 o'clock. Still no cars in the driveway, no laughter in the halls. The candles burned lower, the wine sat untouched, and even the pianist began to play slower, uncertain. The mansion, despite all its lights, felt darker than ever, and what happened next broke him all over again. By 10 o'clock, the last candle had melted halfway down its holder. The piano player stopped pretending and quietly packed his sheet music. The waiters stood near the door, unsure whether to leave or stay. Ethan sat by the main table, staring at the empty seats, each one a reminder of a friend who'd turned their back. He lifted a glass of red wine, the reflection of the chandelier trembling in the liquid. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Here's to no one." Then he let out a quiet laugh, not of humor, but of pain. For the first time, he truly saw the truth. Those who had applauded his success never intended to stand beside him in his fall. Clara watched from a distance, her heart heavy. She'd spent the whole evening hoping, silently praying that someone would show up, if only to spare him this humiliation. But the phone never rang. The door never opened, and the man who once ruled the room now looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. Not because of the wheelchair, but because of the emptiness around him. She couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, Clara walked toward him. Ethan looked up, his eyes tired, glistening with tears he refused to let fall. She knelt beside him, just as she had that night months ago, and took his hand gently. "If nobody believes in you," she said softly, "I do. And I'm not leaving." He blinked, stunned. Her voice didn't carry pity, only truth. In that instant, the weight on his chest eased for the first time in months. A single tear escaped down his cheek as he looked at her, truly looked at her, the only person who had never asked for anything, who had never left. And at that moment, something inside him began to heal. After that night, something shifted inside the mansion, something invisible but powerful. The rooms no longer echoed with emptiness. They began to breathe again. It wasn't because of parties or music, but because of Clara. She didn't try to fix him with words or promises. She simply stayed. And that presence, that quiet loyalty, became the only light Ethan had left. Every morning, she would prepare breakfast for 2. The long table that once seated dozens now had only 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 lives. that somehow fit perfectly within the silence. At first, Ethan barely ate. He'd stare at his food, lost in thought, but Clara never pushed. She would just sit across from him and talk about the little things. The weather, the garden, a stray cat that had started visiting the porch. Slowly, those small conversations began to pull him back to life. In the afternoons, she would roll his wheelchair to the balcony that overlooked the garden. The air outside was warm, and sometimes she'd read to him. Old novels, poetry, even love stories he once found foolish. Now every word sounded different, like a promise that hope could still exist. There were moments of silence, too. But for the first time, those silences weren't heavy. They were peaceful, shared. Ethan started to smile again, not the rehearsed smile he wore for cameras, but the quiet kind that sneaks in when the heart remembers what it feels like to be human. Clara noticed, but never mentioned it. She just smiled back, pretending not to see his eyes glisten when the sunlight hit them. At night, when loneliness threatened to return, Clara found ways to keep it at bay. Sometimes she'd bring him a cup of tea and sit nearby until he fell asleep. Other times she'd stay in the armchair by his bed, reading or sewing quietly, just so he wouldn't wake up to an empty room. And every time he opened his eyes and saw her there, he felt safe. For the first time since the shooting, he wasn't afraid of the dark, but one night, one quiet, sleepless night, something happened that would change everything again. That night, the house was quieter than usual. Rain whispered against the windows, and the soft hum of thunder rolled in the distance. Ethan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled between pain and memories that refused to fade. The loneliness that had become his nightly companion felt heavier than ever. Clara walked in softly, carrying his evening tea. She set it on the nightstand, her movements gentle, practiced. She tucked the blanket around him, fixed his pillow, and was about to wish him good night when she felt his hand grab her wrist. It wasn't forceful, it was desperate, trembling, almost pleading. Their eyes met. For a second, neither of them spoke. There was no sound but the rain. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely escaped his lips, Ethan said, "I don't want to sleep alone tonight. Please stay." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. There was no pride left in them, only fear, and the longing of a man who had lost everything except the hope of not feeling alone. Clara froze. Her heart raced. She wanted to step back, to remind herself she was just his housekeeper, nothing more. But when she looked at him, really looked, she saw the pain behind his eyes. It wasn't a request born of desire or control. It was a plea from someone who had been abandoned too many times. Slowly she nodded. "All right, I'll stay." She pulled a chair close to his bed at first, but Ethan's voice stopped her again. "Closer," he whispered. So she sat on the edge of the bed, still over the blanket, keeping a respectful distance. He closed his eyes, finally at peace. The rhythm of his breathing slowed, calm and steady. And as the storm outside faded, something quiet and pure filled the room. Not romance yet, but connection. A fragile bridge between two broken souls who had finally found each other in the silence. What started as one night became two, then three, and before either of them realized, it had become a quiet ritual neither dared to break. Each evening, after helping Ethan settle into bed, Clara would sit by his side. Sometimes she'd talk, sometimes she'd just listen, but most nights they didn't need words at all. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the cold silence of loneliness, but the soft kind, shared between two souls who understood each other without speaking. Ethan began to open up in ways he never had before. He talked about the nights he couldn't sleep after the shooting, the weight of the rumors that painted him as a villain, the memories of everything he'd lost. Clara didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. She just listened. And in that listening, Ethan found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. There were moments when laughter returned too, timid at first, then more natural. She would tell small stories from her life. How her mother used to make lemon pie on Sundays, or how she dreamed of seeing the ocean someday. Ethan would smile, picturing it all, and for a moment, the walls of the mansion didn't feel like a prison anymore. At times, he caught himself watching her, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, the way her eyes softened when she smiled. It wasn't the admiration of a man looking at beauty. It was something deeper, something earned. Gratitude slowly became affection, and affection, little by little, turned into love. Clara, too, felt something she couldn't quite name. She had promised herself she'd never cross that line, but every time Ethan looked at her, every time he said her name with that quiet gentleness, something inside her melted. They were no longer just a man and his caretaker. They were two people who had been broken by life, finding warmth again in each other's presence, but neither of them dared to speak it aloud. Not yet, because deep down they both knew that the moment they did, everything would change forever. The days turned into months, and the bond between Ethan and Clara became something sacred. Quiet, steady, unspoken, but undeniable. The mansion, once filled with echoes of pain, now held the rhythm of two people rediscovering what it meant to be alive. She was no longer just the maid who cared for him. She was his reason to wake up each morning. One afternoon, when the air outside carried the scent of autumn leaves, Ethan asked Clara to take him out to the veranda. The sunlight fell soft and golden across the garden, painting everything in warm tones. She wheeled him outside, as she had done 100 times before, but this time something felt different. He seemed nervous, his hands fidgeting on his lap, his breath uneven. When she looked down, she saw a small velvet box resting on the table beside him. Her heart skipped a beat. "Ethan, what is this?" she whispered. He took a deep breath, eyes glistening, and opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring. No diamonds, no extravagance, just something honest and real, much like her. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling but strong. "When everyone turned away, you stayed. When the world doubted me, you believed. And when I couldn't find a reason to keep living, you became that reason. I don't want you to just stand beside me in my pain anymore. I want you to walk with me through whatever comes next. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face before she even realized she was crying. Her hands covered her mouth, her heart racing like never before. Then through her tears she smiled, the most genuine smile Ethan had ever seen. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." And as the autumn wind moved through the trees, Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. For the first time since the accident, it wasn't from pain, it was from peace. He had lost everything once, only to realize that what truly mattered had been beside him all along. News of their engagement spread faster than Ethan could have imagined. The same people who had disappeared from his life now began to reappear. Distant relatives, business partners, even so-called friends who once whispered behind his back. They showed up at the mansion gates with lowered heads and awkward smiles, carrying words of apology that came too late. "Ethan, we were wrong," one cousin said, eyes avoiding his. "We believed the wrong things. We left you when you needed us the most." Ethan listened quietly, letting them speak. He didn't need to argue or remind them of their absence. The silence between them said everything. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but he realized something important. Holding on to anger meant staying chained to the past. And he was finally ready to let go. When the wedding day arrived, the mansion that once symbolized tragedy finally came back to life. The garden bloomed brighter than ever, draped in white and gold. Guests filled the seats that had been empty on that painful night months before. The air buzzed with laughter and music, but this time it was real. Ethan waited at the altar in his wheelchair, dressed in a crisp black suit, dignity radiating from him like light. Then Clara appeared, simple, graceful, breathtaking. Her dress wasn't lavish. It didn't need to be. The glow in her eyes was more beautiful than any diamond. As she walked down the aisle, everyone fell silent. In that moment, the world seemed to pause. No rumors, no pity, no shadows, only truth. When she reached him, Ethan's trembling hands met hers, and together they smiled, two souls who had weathered every storm and still chosen love. When they exchanged vows, even the wind seemed to still. And as the guests clapped, the mansion, once a tomb of sorrow, finally felt alive again. Ethan had lost his ability to walk, but he had learned how to stand tall in every way that mattered. And Clara, the woman the world once overlooked, had become his heart, his home, his redemption. As the sun set behind the trees, he looked at her and whispered, "You didn't just stay. You saved me." And in that quiet, golden light they both knew the party that once ended in silence had finally found its song.